for us, and now the person who really got up very early for us, Michael Barnard from living in Vancouver. Very happy to have you on board, Chief Strategist of TFIE strategy, who will talk about the United States and the Canadian wind power market. Michael, pleased to have you on board. Now the floor is yours. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Danke, Stefan. Bom dia, Everardo. I've lived in far too many places, so I've picked up smatterings of bad languages from around the world, which possibly makes it good that I get the tiny geography compared to the previous two speakers of most of North America, except for Mexico. I am Chief Strategist with the Future is Electric Strategy, Inc. Some of you may remember when I was the Senior Fellow of Wind with the Energy and Policy Institute out of Washington, published on legal cases around health and wind, finding unsurprisingly that wind energy doesn't cause health impacts a few years ago. And I've broadened my span to larger scale energy and low carbon transformation markets. Now I'll try to, there we go. So a few minutes on the United States. We had, over the past couple of years, an odd political situation, which some of you may have heard about in the United States, where a president and administration that were favorable to wind, even if it was mixed within the different structures of government, were replaced by almost entirely a group of people and a president who were unfavorable to wind. That's put significant headwinds in place in some places, but despite that, the United States has grown its wind generation capacity quite substantially over the past couple of years. An additional 9.1 gigawatts of capacity last year, 300 terawatt hours of electrical generation. It's now at 7.3% of total electrical demand, and the total installed 105.6 gigawatts. I was looking at the statistics compared to Europe, to give a sense, and Europe's around 205, 208 gigawatts. So this is more than 50% of what Europe has with less than half the population. But there's a ratio to understand there, which is that the United States is a very high energy consumption country compared to most of the countries in the world. The United States still has one of the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions in terms of CO2 or equivalent. And so the wind energy, despite being very large, is a small percentage of the overall generation. Now, there was a plan or an expectation for a record 14.3 gigawatts of new capacity this year. Obviously, that's not likely to happen under the new model. Wind energy, the electricity from wind energy at 7.3% has not been as adversely affected as fossil fuel consumption because we haven't transitioned, obviously, in the United States to electric transportation. Most of the trains that do exist still run on diesel and are not electrified. So cars are obviously still dominated by internal combustion cars. So the reduction in transportation has not reduced the demand nearly as much for electricity. A lot of the heating that occurs this time of year is occurring from natural gas furnaces. Once again, that's been substantially diminished in commercial and industrial spaces. So the wind energy is not impacted directly. The reduction, the relatively easy, low touch maintenance of wind farms has made them quite advantageous. There hasn't been much in the news about that. The problem we're facing in the United States is less associated with that than the political focus on bailing out the oil and gas industry and other industries. The Congress and the President have gone through, are entering their third stimulus package, And still there's been no stimulus for renewable energy. Quite the opposite, there's been dismissive statements made about renewables at the federal level in the United States. For any of you who have followed President Donald Trump's rhetoric around wind energy, this will come as no surprise to you. There are a couple of things to call out though. 2019, a bipartisan group agreed to a 1-year extension of the production tax credit for wind. There's an expected 2020 cliff, a concern that the reduction of the substantially diminished but still present tax break per megawatt hour would go away, and that was extended for 1 year. So 2020 still has a movement forward. There are some key regional things to call out. You'll note down at the bottom, Texas, the Panhandle, is the largest wind generation state in the United States by far. It's also a very physically big state, but what's interesting there is that politically it is a very Republican, a very right-leaning state, and yet it's gone from 6% to over 20% of its electrical demand met by wind energy in roughly a decade. In that time, it's gone from the worst grid stability in the United States, and the grid stability in the United States is abysmal by European standards, with an average of 4 hours per person of blackouts, compared to Germany's 15 minutes per year per consumer of blackout, of disruption. So they've gone from the worst in the United States to actually quite substantially better. So the increase in grid reliability has been tracking very closely and very strongly correlated with the increase in wind generation in a right-leaning Republican state. So that's an important thing to realize, and it's being leaned into. The American Wind Energy Association has transformed from when I was working with it a few years ago. Of course, as a lobbying organization, it's being now dominated by people with Republican connections, and all the people that I know there are now working in other organizations. Other things to note, the lower right of the screen, the southern states, the same states that are being heavily impacted by coronavirus, there's no wind energy still there. They are dominated by nuclear, coal, and natural gas generation, and politically they have been opposed to wind energy. Also note that the United States actually has an offshore wind farm now, surprisingly. It's a 30 megawatt wind farm. It's a test wind farm. Offshore wind is still virtually non-existent. There's projects underway. It's unclear how many of those will actually proceed forward. From a coronavirus perspective, the American Wind Energy Association under Kiernan suggests a third of the jobs in wind energy, 35,000, are at risk. There's 25 gigawatts of projects in the pipeline for 2020 and 2021, which are at risk, and $43 billion in investment. They've been lobbying with no success, the federal government in the United States, to include renewable targets and renewable support in the stimulus packages. But as we understand it, President Trump explicitly removed an earmarked funding for wind and solar from the third stimulus package. By comparison, the fossil fuel heavy dominated federal government in the United States has been spending quite a bit of time figuring out how to get the fossil fuel industry back on its feet. So that is a pattern for North America, which I'll lean into a bit for Canada as well. Moving on to Canada. Canada is different politically, differently challenged politically. We don't have a production tax credit. We don't have a federal supporting structure for wind energy. We don't have a federal feed-in tariff structure. We have provincial variance across Canada in terms of policies. We have Ontario has traditionally been the powerhouse for wind energy, but it was also became the lightning rod politically for wind energy. When the new Premier Doug Ford was elected a year or two ago, one of his first actions of his government was to cancel over 700 renewables contracts, including a 60% built wind farm in Prince Edward County was shuttered and shut down. And then another wind farm elsewhere was also canceled purely on political grounds. That's being very expensive for the government of Ontario, with hundreds of millions of dollars of contractual breaches that they've had to deal with. But it has meant that Ontario's most populous and richest province is a not favorable market for wind energy at this point. Next to it, our second biggest province, Quebec. Quebec is also the hydroelectric powerhouse for Canada, with the James Bay hydro facility providing electricity for Eastern Canada and for New York and populous parts of Northeast United States. They actually fairly quietly built almost 4 gigawatts of wind capacity on the windy St. Lawrence River, but have slowed down substantially after completing the last tranche of that. The hope for the Canadian wind energy was Alberta, the second province from the left. Many of you will know Alberta better as the center of the oil sands, a large deposit of oil and clay mixed petroleum with higher than average greenhouse gas emissions per barrel of oil extracted. Most of Canada's energy arguments and politics these days are focused around the oil sands and pipelines from the oil sands to the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. We had a provincial government which was favorable to renewables from 2015 to 2019, the Rachel Notley New Democratic Party. They established auctions for renewables. They established a target to shut down coal generation in the province, which I believe coal had 55% of the electrical generation demand from that province. And the target was to eliminate it by 2030 and replace that about 60% by renewables, 40% by natural gas. There's a lot of natural gas in the province as well. Obviously better, but not perfect. Subsequently, early in 2019, Rachel Notley was replaced by a conservative premier, Jason Kenney. The entire question about the projects had been sold into auction at roughly 2 cents USD per kilowatt hour prices for wind and solar was what would happen. The pipeline stalled completely through the second half of 2019 as all developers were concerned that a repeat of what happened in Ontario with cancellation of new contracts and new builds would occur under a similarly politically motivated premier. That unlocked. The premier is not focused on new projects, but the projects were proceeding forward prior to coronavirus coming in. So there's 200 to 400 megawatts of wind generation capacity projects that were underway. Much of it on Indigenous land. There's a 200 megawatt wind farm on the largest First Nations band in Southern Alberta as it is. From a coronavirus perspective, the language that we've been discussing, all the new wind projects are at risk. Everything for 2020 and 2021 is up in the air at this point. The discussion has been around force majeure and frustration as both as legal terms, because all wind projects and all construction projects are delayed. It's the question there is what contractual structures apply, and who's going to bear the costs as we go forward. From a governmental response, right now, the governmental response that's being formed, there's a significant amount of debate. The focus has been almost entirely on bailing out in the near term the oil and gas industry, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, both provinces which have seen quite extraordinary impacts because they're major oil producers. There has been no discussion in the stimulus packages, despite lobbying of stimulus for renewables in the short term. There is some good news there, though. The Liberals did institute a carbon tax for Canada, do have a climate plan, are making it more aggressive, and the post-coronavirus stimulus they're starting to discuss has earmarks for the transformation to a more low-carbon economy, and a stronger push on renewables and things like that. So with luck, after we get through the crisis, after we get through the next 2 years, the wind energy in Canada will start increasing again. Thank you so much, Stefan. I see that there's some notes. I'm not sure there's questions, but.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent overview and a critical and realistic one. I like that very much, to understand what is the situation in North America, and as being involved also personally, in particular in this more than 10 years ago in Ontario. It's on the one hand a bit sad that the things are not moving as fast as we wanted them to move, but there is at least some progress, as we have heard. Now, as you are the last speaker, indeed, let's have a look whether we have any specific questions for you. I checked them and I haven't seen a specific one for you. We can ask the audience whether anybody would like to raise their hand and ask you directly. But I think it covered indeed many aspects. There is one message now coming in. Yeah, but ACP countries, I don't think that that is related to United States and Canada. Good. So, Michael, was great have you sharing your insights with us, indeed. And it's also very good to hear that you worked on the health aspects, because that's certainly a topic that we might come back in a future webinar. Certainly very important once we've overcome the big health crisis, speak about the smaller health problems that some people believe they are facing. So with this, again, a great thank you. I think we come to the end of our webinar. I have in the meantime got a message from Ibrahim Togola, and obviously even WhatsApp, just text messages are not getting through well. He's struggling with internet connection. So that seems at the moment not possible to have him connected with us. He tried to update us on the situation in West African countries, but I'm sure that we will get something from him, and we will share that then on our website. So that's certainly what we want to do. We are recording this webinar, and unless any of the speakers doesn't want to be included, we want to put that online. Also the PowerPoint presentations that you have presented, all of you, so that those who want to have a second look at what was the presentation, what were the presentations about, can have that, and also those who have not been able to participate now can listen to you later. Yeah, with this, thank you very much. I think we really made a huge journey around the world in spite of all the travel restrictions that we have, but we're really getting into a new phase of human existence, I would almost say, because we understand now how precious actually it's been that we can visit each other, that we can travel to each other, and now we have to kind of get used to the new situation, but humans can adjust fast. So just after a couple of weeks, we found this format. That's certainly not the last webinar that we've had. It's the first webinar, and we have a number of topics already on our agenda, including, for example, as has been mentioned, on policies, discuss more in depth the impact of auctions, feed-in tariffs, other support schemes for wind power. We'll certainly take up the important topic that's been raised by several people of community power, community ownership, how that is related to the progress of wind power. We certainly come back to the Corona crisis and how the government should make sure that once this crisis is over and we start to restore our economies, how wind power and renewables in general can help to do that faster. And I believe, and there was also a comment on that, that is even one aspect or one way of restoring our economies, reviving our economies. It wouldn't cost money, but that would bring economic benefits. So there is many topics. I was very happy that quite many of you participated. We had, I think, up to 120, 130 people. Still 60 people are with us now. We've had 250 registrations in total, and I saw people coming and going. So I say we had certainly around 200 participants, which is very good for this first webinar. Please let us know your feedback. Send us an email, contact us on Facebook, contact us on LinkedIn.